So the Atlanta Hawks season is over, and as is tradition when your season is over and you're a play-in or a playoff team, we're going to talk about the offseason for you. And the Atlanta Hawks certainly have an interesting offseason. A lot of decisions to be made for a team that I actually think should be pretty good. Now, the interesting thing about Atlanta is that they don't really have a lot of decisions that are forced upon them this offseason. They have $163 million committed in payroll for next season. They only have one guy that actually matters to their rotation that is an impending free agent, and that is Saddiq Bey. Everybody else is under contract, and most of them are under contract for multiple seasons. Clint Capella is a 2025 free agent, and apart from that, they've got guys locked up on long-term deals. Jalen Johnson's still on a rookie deal. DeAndre Hunter is on a new deal. Onyeka Okongwu's on a new deal. DeJounte Murray, Trae Young, all these guys are signed long-term. The problem for Atlanta is they're not very good. They have tried multiple different versions of the roster. They have tried multiple different coaches over the years, and ever since they made that conference finals run a handful of years ago, they just have not been able to figure it out. And when I look at the roster, I say this every time I talk about the Hawks and I talk about their future and I talk about their offseason, they should be better than they are. That's why they continue to change coaches. They brought in Quinn Snyder, who I think is a very good coach, and even he has not been able to figure out exactly what to do with this roster. Now, granted, just like every other team in the league, they dealt with some injury issues, but from a talent perspective, especially like the top 7 guys, you're talking about Trae Young, DeJounte Murray, Bogey, who I still really like, DeAndre Hunter, who when he plays is still pretty good, Jalen Johnson had a really good season for them this year, Okongwu, Clint Capella, all these guys together, that should get you better than how Atlanta finished this season. So what that means to me is that changes need to be made. They need to shake some things up on this roster, and primarily, the conversation is going to revolve around the two guards, DeJounte Murray and Trae Young. Atlanta took a big swing a couple of off seasons ago trying to improve their chances of becoming a contender. They felt like having someone like DeJounte Murray to have the ball in his hands a little bit more, make Trae Young a little bit more of an off-ball player, make their offense a little bit less predictable, especially in the postseason, and help defensively in the backcourt alongside Trae Young. They felt like that was a better long-term fit than someone like Kevin Huerter, who they traded away to Sacramento to kind of make way for bringing in DeJounte Murray. The problem is it just has not worked. These two guys just don't work well on the floor together. It is very much a your turn, my turn kind of situation. Trae doesn't want to be off the ball. DeJounte Murray is much less valuable when he is off the ball because he's not nearly as good of a floor spacer as Trae Young is. And it's just a problem. The team doesn't operate efficiently at all when they're both out there. They're both just kind of taking turns. And anytime that happens, you're not elevating your team by bringing in two guys like that. At some point, you need to make a change, especially when you consider the overall expense of the roster relative to the production, at least in the regular season. And to me, I don't really care which one they trade. I probably would rather keep DeJounte Murray. I think his skill set works a little bit better around what you could potentially bring in. He's cheaper as well. But if I was the Hawks, I would just go around the league and say, hey, each of these guys are available. What's your best offer? And whoever I can get more for, that's the guy I would trade. It's that simple to me. I think one of these players needs to be moved. There is no way they can go into the season with DeJounte Murray and Trae Young still being their starting backcourt. Get some value out of one of the guys. I understand that because of some of the contract stuff or because of just some issues with each of their games, you might not get a ton in exchange. This might not be multiple first-round picks and some young guys, but at a certain point, change needs to be made, and I would definitely expect one of these two guys to get moved. It seems more realistic that DeJounte Murray would be the one to get traded. He's already been traded once in his career. Trae Young feels a little bit more integral to what Atlanta does moving forward, but we've gotten reports in the past about frustration with Trae Young from Atlanta, with the team not being better, and so I would be surprised if it is him. Now, the good thing for Atlanta is that even though they do owe some future picks, they owe a 2025 first-round pick to San Antonio as part of the DeJounte Murray trade. In terms of this particular offseason, they have their own first, and they have Sacramento's first, which is lottery protected. So possibility of having multiple first-round picks potentially in the top 20 for Atlanta, which allows them to kind of change some things around with this roster if, for whatever reason, they did want to run it back and try it one more time because, again, theoretically, when you look at the roster, there's talent there. They have a couple of extra picks. Maybe Jalen Johnson continues to improve, and maybe you can kind of work your way up the Eastern Conference standings. The problem is, if there was ever a season in which Atlanta was going to be a top 6 team in the East, it would have been this year. The East, outside of the 1 seed, has not been very good. Teams at the top are dealing with injury issues. and they still weren't able to make anything work. They don't guard well enough. They don't play well enough together. And it's time to make some changes. And I'm going to keep saying this. I like their team. I like their young guys. I think Jalen Johnson's really good. Like, I don't know if he's ever going to be all-star, all-NBA guy, but there is a ton of talent there. And I've said this in previous videos as well. I really like Onyeka Okongwu. He's signed to a long-term contract. It's good value. I think eventually they're going to look to move on from Clint Capella, and they're going to make him the starting five. That might even be as early as this offseason. And I think in a scenario in which Atlanta kind of trims along the edges here a little bit, they trade one of the guards. Maybe they trade Bogey. Maybe they trade Clint Capella, and they have DeAndre Hunter, Okongwu, Jalen Johnson, and then one of the guards they have left over, whether it be Trae Young or DeJounte Murray, and a couple of picks in the first round of this draft. That's not a bad situation to be in. And although it's a difficult situation right now for Atlanta to figure out because it feels like the roster should be better, there's nothing harder to do in the NBA than to fix an underperforming roster that has talent. Even though that's a difficult situation to be in, there is still some hope moving forward here for Atlanta. And this is a team that I'm going to be keeping an eye on all offseason long, because this backcourt conversation is something that is going to continue to come up. And again, I would be very surprised if they don't move one of these guys. Now, the only other counterpoint that I would make to that is Atlanta can probably do the Chicago Bulls version of this, where they talk themselves into some kind of scenario where it's not worth it to rebuild, and they aren't actually that far away from being a top 6, a top 5 team in the conference, and they like their coach, and they like their pieces, and they just continue to run it back. Quinn Snyder hasn't been there very long. They certainly have dealt with an above average level of injury issues with their roster. Now, Trae Young this year was missing time as well, and we saw a successful version of the Atlanta Hawks just a few seasons ago in the postseason with Trae Young leading the way, and it's not impossible that this roster could get back to something close to what that team showed a few years ago. But as I always talk about, anytime we have some kind of Atlanta Hawks video on this channel, you can't just continue to cling to that what appears to be very fluky run to the conference finals as continued evidence of what the team could look like around Trae Young. It is very clear that he is not committed to being even an average NBA defender. It's clear that desire to guard in any way at all comes and goes on a game-to-game, a week-to-week basis. And it's clear that the backcourt doesn't work. And it's one of those situations where everybody on the outside looking in that doesn't actually have to make the decision, that doesn't actually have to make the calls, make the trades, deal with some of the revenue loss. It's very clear to everyone that doesn't have to make those decisions that it's time to rebuild, that it's time to trade one of the guards, that it's time to go a little bit more towards the youth movement. And yes, you tried for years to make something out of a rebuild that really only started a handful of seasons ago, and maybe you tried to go a little bit too quickly with it. But it's clear to everyone else that it's time to rebuild. The problem is a lot of times guys in the front office, ownership, they don't want to. The guys in the front office don't want to get fired. They don't want to rebuild. And the guys in the ownership group, they want the team to be good. They just went through a rebuild a handful of years ago. They don't want to spend another few years trying to rebuild the roster again and trading away some of their guys and also losing interest in the team and losing revenue. It's a much more difficult proposition to actually make those decisions when you're in charge than it is for me to just sit here and talk about it on a video. But at the end of the day, I feel like what I'm here to do is talk about, what I would do, what I think the right choice is in terms of how to build a basketball team. And the best thing they can do this offseason is accumulate assets. It's a sunk cost that they owe their 2025 first to San Antonio. Can't do anything to get that back. Just try and get value, whether it be Trae Young, whether it be DeJounte Murray, whether it be Clint Capella, whether it be Bogdanovich. There are teams out there that would trade for any one of those 4 guys. You can get some stuff back. And again, the other pieces here are actually good. Like, none of them, I don't think, are future All-NBA caliber guys, but they're really, really good. And depending on what you do in the draft over the next couple of seasons, you could be good again in 2 years, in 3 years. I know that's not what you want to hear if you're a Hawks fan. I know that's not what you want to hear if you're, part of the ownership group in Atlanta, but at the end of the day, that's the situation that they have found themselves in. They took their big swings. They certainly have put in a ton of effort to make the roster work by, free agency splashes with Bogey and Gallinari a couple of years ago, changing the roster around, getting rid of Kevin Huerter, getting rid of John Collins, bringing in DeJounte Murray, multiple coaches. They have tried, and whatever it is, whatever combination they have tried, it just has not worked ever since that conference finals run, and it would be foolish to continue to trick yourselves into thinking that at some point things are going to turn around. So very interesting offseason for Atlanta, and I cannot wait to see exactly what direction they decide to go in.